Hi, my name is David Kelsey, and today we're going to talk about formalizing and evaluating arguments. So what we're going to learn today in this lecture is a kind of four-step method to formalizing arguments. And in step one, the first thing you'll do is you'll ask, in the series of steps, you'll ask sort of questions about the argument. So the first question you'll ask, is there any terminology, vocabulary terms at all that are unclear to you, right? And are there any words that you've never seen before, or confusing, or maybe they're being used in a different sense than you're used to, right? So what we want to do with those guys straight away is just try to define anything that we don't understand. Okay. The second step in your new formalization process is to ask the issue. What is the issue of the passage? So if you remember, the issue is just sort of like the topic, the subject, what the author is worried about in a kind of big picture in the passage he or she is writing. Okay. The third step is then the conclusion. We ask what the conclusion of the argument is. And it's good to know that the conclusion of the argument is just the answer to the issue. So whatever the issue is, the conclusion will just answer that question. Okay? And usually what we want to do is find the conclusion of the argument first by trying to look for a kind of conclusion indicator word or phrase like thus or therefore. And what that does is that usually is kind of like a signal to the conclusion of the argument. And then once we found that conclusion, we then look to find the premises of the argument, which is the fourth step to our formalization process. So the idea here with this method is that you find the conclusion first, and then you find the reasons the author is giving to back up that conclusion, right? That's the order. Okay, so we have here then in this lecture, we have here a passage we're going to apply this method to. And this passage is a famous one that's written by J. O. Mackey, a philosopher, Australian philosopher. And it is about this famous kind of argument that is called the argument from evil. And the argument from evil basically just says that, because evil exists, then God cannot exist, right? So the passage goes, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. But at the same time, all three are essential parts of most theological positions. The theologian, it seems, at once must adhere and cannot adhere consistently to all three. However, the contradiction does not arise immediately. To show it, we need some additional premises, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules, he calls them, quasi-logical rules, connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. These additional principles are that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. From these, it then follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and then the propositions that a good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. Okay? So that is the passage we're going to work with. It's kind of a complex one. If you look at it straight away, you can see that there are definitely some tricky terms here, right? So in the very first sentence, he's saying here, God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So we might actually ask, about each of those claims in turn, right? The first about omnipotence, right? God is omnipotent. What is that? Well, God's omnipotence is supposed to be his maximum power, right? So he's supposed to be maximally powerful, right? He's supposed to be able to do anything. Then in the next sort of claim there, he says God is wholly good. I think what he's saying here is that God is maximally good as something could possibly be, right? And then in the last sort of claim there, he says, and yet evil exists. Right, in philosophy, actually, evil is kind of a tricky term. You want to say that evil is kind of like suffering or pain, for example. And we can actually divide that kind of thing into two types. One would be suffering or pain at the hands of a human being, right, with intention, right? Sort of a person that's intending to cause harm. And that's what we call a moral evil. So moral evil is an evil that's done by a person, right? And then on the other hand, you have what's called a natural evil, and a natural evil is like, for example, a hurricane, right, or a tsunami or something like this, an earthquake, which causes pain and suffering, but which isn't done right by any person. Okay, so those are the two types of evils we might worry about here. Obviously there's this kind of phrase that he uses, Mackey uses. He says, to show it, we need some additional premises or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. So obviously quasi-logical is a bit of a strange one, right? So I think for that, what Mackey is really saying is that he wants to think about these terms good, evil, and omnipotent by the rules of logic, right? That's kind of what quasi-logical means, by the rules of logic. So what Mackey intends to do actually is to try to define those words as far as logic will dictate. And then what he thinks is actually you'll have this kind of weird dilemma for God and God's existence as a result, because evil is existing. The next couple terms we have the use of, I think he says theologian in there. Sometimes my students have a tough time with that one. So that's just, theologian is just someone who studies religion, right? And so theology is the study of religion. The last one is he uses at the very end of the passage the word incompatible. So just to be clear about that one, incompatible just means sort of like, most simply sort of doesn't go together or something. But I think the technical way to put it is that when two claims are incompatible, they both cannot be true at the same time, right? Okay, so then, sort of having gotten through those terms, then we can push to the second point, or the second step in our, process here, which is to find the issue of the passage, okay? And so the issue, again, is kind of like what question the author is worried about. And it's always going to be in a yes or no type of question. So there's only going to be two ways to answer it. So if you look back to the passage, right, in the very beginning of the passage, he says, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So the issue here, if you think about it, just approaching a sentence like that as a kind of way to see things in a bigger sense, you can see clearly that Mackey is worried about God here somehow, right? And so we know that the issue somehow concerns God. So we might ask then, what exactly is Mackey, the author, worried about with relation to God? And then if you look back at the end of the passage, you can kind of see an indication of that one. So he says at the very end, he says, from these it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and then the propositions that a good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. So here what it seems that the author is worried about is the existence of God. And that is actually the issue of the passage, whether or not God exists, right? Okay, so then to our next step, which is to find the conclusion of the argument. And of course, the conclusion of the argument is just an answer to the issue. So here the conclusion is going to be either that yes, God does exist, or no, God does not exist, right? Now again, that very last sentence there of the passage where, Mackey is saying, he says, from these it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates evil completely, and then the propositions that a good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. Kind of feels here, essentially, that what Mackey's trying to argue, the author's trying to argue, is that because evil exists, that God doesn't exist, right? So, in fact, Mackey's conclusion here is that God doesn't exist, right? He thinks that because evil does, that God cannot, so God doesn't exist, right? So that is the conclusion of Mackey's argument. God does not exist. Okay, so that then takes us to our next step in the process. Well, basically, we're going to try to search for the premises now. And I think the easiest way to start is just to kind of, when you approach with this method, when you approach finding the premises, which is usually the toughest part, you just have to think again about the why, right? So here we know our author is trying to argue that God isn't real, that God doesn't exist. And you have to think about why he might say that, right? Now, if you look at the very first sentence of the passage, you can see what look to be three reasons why he might claim that. First, he says, in its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. So here we actually have three premises that suggest themselves, which is God's omnipotence, God being wholly good, and yet evil exists. Okay? So those will be our first three premises. God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and then three, evil exists. And again, those all are aiming to show the conclusion that God doesn't exist. The next place we might look in the passage, just kind of following along with the passage, we can see that Mackey then goes on to say, however, the contradiction does not arise immediately. To show it, we need some additional premises or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. So you might think straight away when you read that, well, look, maybe what goes in the argument next is these quasi-logical rules. So then he says, right, Mackey tells us, these additional principles are that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. So then what we're going to say then is that these two principles, these rules, these quasi-logical rules Mackey's talking about, are going to be our next two premises. So one is a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, right? And two, there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, right? So these are kind of like what Mackey thinks these terms mean, right? Mackey thinks that a wholly good being is something that eliminates evil as far as it can, and that an omnipotent being is something that has no limits, right? So if you look then at our list so far, we have 5 premises. They are: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, evil exists, a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can, and there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Now, the interesting thing is that actually when you look at those claims, you see that really the argument is just about complete, right? Consider the following 4 claims, right? 1, God is omnipotent. 2, there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. 3, God is wholly good. And 4, a wholly good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. If you take those 4 claims together, if you sort of add them up, right? But then you also assume that God in fact is real, that God exists, what would have to follow, right? If God is real, and yet omnipotent and wholly good, and an omnipotent thing has no limits, and a wholly good thing would eliminate evil as far as it can, right? Then what would follow if God existed is that evil wouldn't exist. So we're going to actually add that premise. If God exists, then evil doesn't, which is a claim that follows from the first 4 premises here. That'll go as our 5th premise. Okay? Now, if we add that in, that gives us 6 premises, right? The 6 premises are: God is omnipotent. There are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. God is wholly good. A good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. That's the 4th one. 5th premise is: if God exists, then evil doesn't. And then the 6th one is that evil exists. Now, of course, if you look at how 5 and 6 relate here, right? 5 says, if God exists, then evil doesn't. And 6 says that evil does in fact exist. You'll see that what follows from 5 and 6 here is that God doesn't exist. And so that brings us to our conclusion, right? And so we have here our completed formalization. It's 6 premises leading to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And you can see too from this formalization that the conclusion that God doesn't exist really just follows from 5, if God exists, then evil doesn't, and 6, evil exists, right? Okay, so we have our we have our argument then. We have 6 premises and a conclusion. So now the next step in the sort of the process then is to evaluate the argument. So this is where what we do is we develop what's called a counter argument. Okay? And a counter argument, the idea with making a counter argument is that you're trying to challenge Mackey's argument. You're trying to oppose it. You're not supporting what he says. It's not that we like what he says, it's that we're trying to object to it. We're trying to reply to it, to show that there's a fault in the argument. Okay? Now, to show there's a fault in Mackey's argument, there's really one best way to do that, right? A lot of my students in the past have made this mistake, right? It's kind of like this mistake where it's a questionable relevance mistake. And the mistake is this. So I've seen students before try to challenge the conclusion of an opponent's argument. So for example, in Mackey's argument, right, the conclusion he makes here is that God doesn't exist. And so I've had students in the past make a counter argument by just telling me why they think he does exist, right? All the reasons why they think God is real. But the kind of problem with this move is that it's completely irrelevant to what Mackey's done, right? Mackey here has given us an argument in favor of the conclusion that God doesn't exist. So to reply to Mackey, we've got to reply to his argument, to his support, to his premises in favor of the conclusion that God doesn't exist, right? That's the idea. So we've somehow got to reply to one of the 6 premises that Mackey gives in favor of his 7th claim that God doesn't exist here. And so when you make counter arguments, what you do is you challenge and you try to find fault in the premises of the argument, right? Not in the conclusion. And then what we'll do is essentially, what we're trying to do is essentially knock down his support for that conclusion. And if we can cast doubt on that support, right, and show there's weakness in it, then the argument doesn't work anymore, and then he doesn't have any argument anymore for that conclusion, right? Now, the last point I want to make is a point about how this kind of move needs to be made, right? So when I first got into philosophy, I thought that the whole idea of a counter argument was like sort of destroying somebody else's argument, like casting a bomb on it, essentially, to utterly destroy it, so there's no sense in which they can reply, right? Well, that's actually completely wrong, and actually making a counter argument is not that difficult. The idea with the counter argument is that you have to just suggest a reason to doubt one of the premises of the opponent's argument, right? And what I can do here is to make the point is to bring up what's called the burden of proof, right? And I think the idea of the burden of proof is really helpful in developing an understanding of how to make a counter argument, okay? So if you think about what Mackey's done for us, right? Mackey's essentially given us a pretty stand-up argument against the existence of God. Now, here you have Mackey, and then here you have, say, me, who objects to Mackey's argument, right? So what Mackey does in giving that argument is he gives a nice justified proof, right? So then what that does, essentially, is that puts a bit of pressure on me, someone who objects to Mackey, to try to reply. So what we say then is that because Mackey's given this stand-up argument, that the burden to prove is on me. And what that essentially means is that the burden is on me to try to respond to Mackey. And then what happens is, the way it works is that once I've given an adequate response to Mackey, the burden then shifts back to Mackey, and then he has to respond to my objection, my counter argument. Okay? And so wherever the burden lies, the burden of proof lies, is the person that sort of needs to stand up and give some kind of reply, right? If you've ever seen a debate, that's kind of how debates work, right? One team gives an argument, and then that shifts the burden of proof to the other team, and then they have to defend, and the burden of proof shifts back and forth, and then kind of the winning team is wherever the burden of proof is not, right? And that's essentially how debates go. Now, for our purposes then, the idea is to think about it really simply, right? Mackey, again, has given us this stand-up argument against the existence of God. Now, those of us who want to try to fight that and reply and object to what he's saying, the burden to prove him wrong is on us, essentially. So now, what we have to do is we have to come up with a stand-up counter-argument to him. And the idea is our objective is to shift the burden back to Mackey, back to the opponent, right? So now, what we want to do is to shift the burden. All you have to do, instead of destroying Mackey's argument, is just cast enough doubt on a piece of it so that he has to defend, right? That's it. So all I have to do really when I build my counter argument is just build a little bit of doubt about one of his premises. And if I'm able to build a little bit of doubt about one of his premises, then again, the burden of proof is back on him. He's got to defend that premise then, right? Okay, so then given now that we understand the idea of the burden of proof and the idea of making the counter, let's try to do it, right? So the first point I'm going to make here is about what is actually his sixth premise. So the sixth premise of his argument is that evil exists. Personally, what I like to do when I think about counter arguments is just to consider, almost just for the fun of it, just to see how it goes, consider why we might doubt something that seems pretty reasonable from Mackey's perspective, I think most people would accept the fact that there is evil in this world, right? There's evil people, there's evil actions, and there's evil events, right? But maybe for a second we might consider why might someone think that there isn't, right? We might argue then that evil isn't real because morality isn't real, and morality isn't real because we might argue that it's relative, for example, to the culture, to the time period, right? So a couple examples again that I can give. One is that if you think back throughout human history, there have been things like, sort of ritual sacrifices that have been performed, You can think about there's some history of things like cannibalism, for example. And then there's this, another example I have is a good example. If you think just back to this country 200 years ago, and how, like to the Wild West, and how guns and really murder and all those types of things were looked at back then, very different than now, And then lastly, you can even think about this tribe, a group of people very far north called the Inuits, and they used to practice something called infanticide, which is sort of like the killing of an infant, right? And they used to do that because it's very, the resources there are very different, right? Very difficult, and so if they couldn't provide for an infant, they would often set it out in the cold to die. I'm not sure about how much they do that anymore, but nevertheless, the idea is that you can see throughout history, and really throughout the different parts of the world, morality seems to kind of bend and flex a bit, and so you might argue, right, that it's really not there at all. I like to give this analogy to something like fashion. Fashion is something that is completely relative to society. It's relative to what people think, and it changes all the time, right? So you might argue that morality is kind of like that. It just changes to what people think, and so it's not really there. And if it's not really there, then neither is evil, The other point I'll add in as a kind of support to, again, just cast a little bit of doubt on the existence of evil is just consider the fact that when you consider ideas like capital punishment or abortion or euthanasia, right? These are really sort of controversial topics. And people really have quite different views on these things. And it's oftentimes very hard to convince someone otherwise, So whatever they think about abortion, it's pretty tricky to, sort of convince them that their thinking needs to be changed, right? And again, all this kind of suggests that, ideas and viewpoints about morality may not be real at all. It's just a kind of flexible, changing, relative thing. And so maybe evil isn't real at all. I think one more point I'll make about this one, and it's a really simple one. I always like to think about the fact that, if you just think about the animal kingdom, for example, and you think about, how you have a lion, for example, hunting an antelope, right? And if you take away human beings, there are no human beings on this planet, and you just have an antelope being hunted by a lion, or other animals hunting other animals, that's really all there is to it. It's survival of the fittest. It's just nature, And so this again kind of seems to suggest that maybe morality is just like human creation or something, right? Which suggests maybe that's how evil is. I don't know. I personally believe that evil is real, but again, all I'm trying to do is to suggest that maybe there's some reason to doubt one of Mackey's premises. That's all. And again, that's all you have to do is you just cast a bit of doubt on something that he says, and that shifts the burden back on him. Okay. Now, the other way we might approach replying to Mackey's argument, and really the honest truth is there are many, many good responses to what Mackey says in this argument from evil, famous argument. So the other one we might challenge, right? If you look back at the argument, premise 4, right? A good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. If you think about that concept, right, essentially what Mackey's trying to do is tell us that a holy good thing like God is going to have this sort of plan of doing as much as he can to eliminate evil, right? At all costs, right? But again, I think one way to think about it is that maybe, who are we to say that we know God's plan at all, right? Who are we to say that we know that God really thinks that, even though God is good, maybe he has some other kind of intent, right, for us and for the universe, something that we can't even fathom, that we can't even understand, right? And so I think one of the ways to respond is just to suggest that maybe Mackey's off track with this premise that a holy good being would always eliminate evil, because we just simply can't understand what God and God's intentions would be, right? But I think another way to think about replying to Mackey's argument here, and to in particular that particular premise, is to suggest something about freedom, right? Freedom of the will. And so I think this kind of counter argument is fairly good. And actually the theist, the theologian, somebody who's a Christian, would say exactly this, right? And so the point goes like this, right? First, God grants human beings freedom of the will, right? And in doing so, the problem that Mackey's going to raise is that, well, look, if he grants us freedom of the will, knowing that human beings are going to commit evil acts, right? Then, of course, in God doing that, then God is essentially, not blocking that evil, right? He's essentially being a part of its creation, right? Which goes against his goodness, right? So that seems to be a problem. But if you know the story of Christianity and the idea of freedom, it makes a lot of sense what the response here would be. And the response is really this, right? God has granted human beings freedom of the will, even knowing that evil could result from that freedom of the will, because he's testing us, right? That's how the story goes in the Bible, right? It's a test, right? And the test is just simply to determine whether or not we're worthy of going to heaven or not, right? And so, why are we free, and why do human beings commit evil acts? Because we're all under this kind of test to see if we're really worthy of going to heaven or not, right? And if you think about it, it seems like a justifiable answer, because how else would he test us other than granting us a kind of free choice, right? It's not like if we were if that freedom was stripped away from us, it's not like we could somehow choose God, of our own will, right? And so what he does is he gives us this free choice to see if we'll make the right choice and choose him, right? And then, of course, that's just part of this sort of test. But then as a result, what ends up happening is that, bad people do bad things, out of those free choices, right? So it's, I think, a really good response, actually, probably one of my favorites to Mackey. And it's actually the Christian kind of conception of freedom of the will, which we're stating here. So it all works pretty well, I think. But anyway, I think that's going to be it for this one. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.